Never celebrate too early. That's the lesson that we sort of begun the time with this morning. Never celebrate too early. And surely we leave off the Good Friday story with Satan and the principalities and powers in a place of celebration. Surely they must have felt at that point that Jesus is defeated, that the man who had said he was God was dead, and there was nothing that he could do about it. He was taunted on the cross to do something about it. 3 times it's recorded to him, "Physician, heal yourself. You who said you would do all these things, save yourself." And Jesus didn't. Not because he couldn't, but because he wouldn't at that moment. And they must have surely have felt in those moments that they had won. That Jesus was dead, God was defeated, his plan of salvation thwarted. And yet, never celebrate too early. For 3 days later, Jesus rises from the tomb. He proves he's not a loser. And the story of Good Friday is not one primarily to be feeling sorry for little old Jesus who's been so badly treated, and to give Jesus some sympathy, because he really needs that. He really needs to know that you feel bad for him. In fact, if you come out of Good Friday with your primary feeling, if feeling bad, then you've misunderstood what's happening. You've forgotten the ending, that he's not a loser, and he's not looking for your sympathy. He's not looking for you to simply feel bad for your sins, but to turn away from your sins, trusting that he's risen to give you new life, to forgive you of sins, to cleanse you from sins. And so as Jesus rises on that Sunday morning, he proves he's not a loser. It's a statement of victory. You don't need to feel sorry for him and have sympathy for him. He's triumphed. He's the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. He's to be celebrated now in awe and in worship. And so from this passage in John chapter 20, I just want to pick out 4 particular things I think are really important about the account of the resurrection here. Can't go through every single verse in detail, so we won't do it in that way this morning. But I want to pull out 4 really important things just to hold on to. And I know it will be difficult in some ways because it's a story, much like Christmas, that for many of us is really familiar. And yet that's where we have to do even more work, just to really remember the central truths. And so I want to say 4 things about the resurrection this morning. Firstly, it's historical. That is, it really happened. Secondly, that it was physical. He's really physically resurrected in a physical body. Number 3, it's central. The resurrection of Jesus is central to Christian theology. This is not a sort of side tangent thing. This is right in the middle, right in the heart of what it means to be a Christian, is to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. It's absolutely central. And fourthly, it changes everything. Firstly, the resurrection is historical. And what I mean by that is that it really happened. And John, like the other gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, records the resurrection in such a way as to make it clear that this is a historical event. This really happened. We were really there. We really saw it. We read of Mary, John and Peter here all seeing the tomb empty. And one of the interesting things about the resurrection stories, and there are many who are very skeptical of it and raise certain critiques about it, but one of the interesting things to note from the narrative here, from those who were there, is nobody challenges the empty tomb. Everybody, every protagonist, every character in the story accepts that the tomb is empty. And therein lies the real problem for everyone. In fact, actually, this is a conundrum for absolutely anyone, whatever your belief is. What do you say about the emptiness of the tomb? Because everybody who is there agrees that that tomb was empty, that they placed a dead body in there 3 days before, and they come to it on Sunday and it's empty. So how do we answer that? Where has he gone? What has happened? It's interesting that all the key protagonists there agree. In Matthew's account, in chapter 28, verses 11 to 15, we see the disciples agree, the guards agree that the body's gone, the chief priests and the elders even agree, and then they come up with a conspiracy theory as to what's happened to feed people to explain it away. Because they know that this question of the emptiness of the tomb is going to be huge. Now, if the tomb's empty, the natural question then is going to be, well, he said that he was going to die and rise again, so maybe that's exactly what's happened. We don't want people to think that, so put out this story that his disciples robbed the grave and took it there with them to make it appear like he'd risen from the dead. But everybody agrees that the tomb is empty, and that leaves you with a problem, no matter what it is you may currently believe about that. We read that the tomb's empty, but it gives us this odd sort of detail here in verse 7 here of chapter 20, that they go into the tomb and they find the face cloth folded up there. They find that there's no body, tomb is empty. Disciple whom Jesus loved, it's John's way of saying him, but without saying his own name. He's always a little bit coy about actually just naming himself as that disciple, but it's John there and Peter. Mary Magdalene goes and tells them that Jesus' body isn't there, doesn't know what's happened at this point. They go and to check it out. They run into the tomb. They find it empty, except for a face cloth folded up in one place. Strange detail to add. Is it just telling us that, Jesus was a little bit OCD and just sort of, as he's on his way out, he can't bear but to leave his face cloth sort of neatly folded there for everyone to find? It's a strange detail. I want you to make note of that. That's important about the historicity, the validity of the account, that there's a strange detail given here. One which you would only really remember if it was true. And in fact, actually, interestingly, the resurrection accounts check out when we compare them with contemporary sort of psychologists' analysis of how to determine whether someone is giving you a true account. There's an article here in Psychology Today by a writer called Susan Krauss Whitbourne. 9 ways to tell someone's lying to you. And it's remarkable how many of these things the gospel accounts hit. In fact, all of the ones that are relevant to a written testimony, as opposed to someone being in front of you and reading body language and other things as well, non-verbal cues, the gospel accounts hit all of these expectations. Number one, a sign that someone may be lying to you, it says that they'll leave out sensory details. That is, they won't add in those little bits of information like the colour of the flowers on the table or the particular music that was playing when the incident happened. Those are the things that you remember when you're telling the truth. You remember those little details. And so the fact that disciples are able to remember little details like this points to the historicity, the validity, the truth of what they're saying. They find the face cloth folded up in a neat pile. Number 3 was that when someone's lying, commonly they'll make spontaneous corrections. That is, the story will kind of keep changing. One of the things about the gospel accounts is they're remarkably consistent and they never change. Nobody ever goes back on it and remembers details that they hadn't at the time. There's a consistency to them. There's no spontaneous corrections. They keep to the same story. One of the things my mum used to say to me was, you've got to have a good memory to be a good liar. That you've got to keep the story the same. One of the ways that you tell that someone's lying is they can't keep the story the same. They forget. The gospel writers keep the story the same. Number 4 was that commonly when people are lying, they keep their accounts short and vague. Because you've got to have a good memory to be a good liar. So it's easier to remember less. And to keep it short, keep it pretty vague and unclear. The gospel accounts are longer and much more detailed. Give details that you'd only add in if it really happened. Number 5, commonly when someone's lying, the story begins at some point to break down in terms of the sense, the logic of it starts to go. And there start to be contradictions, inevitably. The gospel accounts always make sense. There's never a contradiction to them. And number 8, there's very few complaints or negative comments made when someone's lying. They always want to put the most positive picture of themselves over. In fact, one of the common ways you can sort of sniff out an untruth is they do too much to make things too clean. They airbrush themselves too much. Whereas actually the gospel accounts are really frank and open about the negative and embarrassing moments that the disciples and the first witnesses have, where they don't believe things, where they mistake Jesus and things. They keep that in. That's the kind of thing you would only do if that was just what happened and you were just trying to relay the story as it was. And look at the reaction of the disciples here in the story. What's the first reaction? They don't believe. In fact, actually in Luke's account, chapter 24, verses 10 to 11, it says that they wouldn't believe. They took it to be an idle tale. Mary Magdalene comes to the disciples and says, look, they've taken Jesus. I don't know where his body is. Notice how her first response is that they've taken him. It's not that he's risen. It's that, well, someone must have stole the body. Even Mary's not expecting it either. But they won't believe her. They just take it for an idle tale. They didn't initially believe. Again, that's one of those details you would not admit unless that was what really happened. You wouldn't fabricate it that way. It makes you look bad. Telltale sign of a cover-up is making yourself look too good. Number 3, the third thing we notice here. So firstly, we notice there's strange detail. Secondly, there's the inclusion of the fact that they didn't actually initially believe, the disciples. Number 3, the first witness is Mary Magdalene. The third thing that points to its historicity is the fact that the first witness is Mary Magdalene. You would not add this if this wasn't true, because it's wrong, but at that time in court, the witness of a woman was discredited. It was essentially worthless. It really didn't matter if a woman had witnessed something. Their testimony didn't count. And of course that's wrong. And in Jewish law, we know that it's on the basis of 2 men witnessing to something that something can be proven true. So you wouldn't add Mary as the first witness unless that was the way it really happened, because right from the off, you're raising a question about the quality of your testimony. We know that this is the case, not just from biblical sources, but also from secular historians of the time. This is the writing of a Greek philosopher named Celsus, who was a famous opponent of the early church, who says, how can anyone expect rational men to listen to the testimony of a hysterical female? You would not tell the story this way unless that was just how the story went. That was just how it happened. Fourthly, why in the world would the disciples, if they did steal the body of Jesus, unwrap the body partially too? It doesn't really make sense. Why would they unwrap the face? In fact, why would they leave behind the one sort of piece of valuable in the tomb, which is the spices and the perfume and the linen on the face? If this is a robbery, it's the most nonsensical robbery of all time, really. And furthermore, we're given the plot to explain away the absence of the body. We know where this idea that, well, Jesus didn't rise again, just somebody stole his body, whether it was the disciples who were so eager to have a resurrection story and so disappointed that it didn't really happen, that they steal Jesus' body and they fake it and they proclaim it still because they wanted his memory to go out and they wanted his teaching to be kind of listened to. Yet we know actually where that story begins, because in Matthew's account, chapter 28, verses 11 to 50, we hear the religious leaders giving that exact story of, right, this is what you need to tell people so that people don't believe that he's been resurrected, because we don't want that, regardless of whether it's true. You need to tell people that his disciples have come in and stolen the body, even though we know that that's not what happened. It just doesn't seem a very feasible thing to hold on to. Number 4, there's the embarrassing moments that are included within the story that you wouldn't include unless this was how it had really happened. We hear of, in verse 15, Mary mistaking Jesus for the gardener. Able to recognise that he's in human body, but I think probably mostly a case of just simply assuming that he couldn't possibly be resurrected, so it must be the gardener. I'm not sure it's that Jesus looks so different that she can't recognise him. It's probably more just that she's so much assuming that he couldn't possibly be risen again that, well, it must be the gardener or somebody. We hear of the disciples being locked up in their upper room for fear. Where, again, why would you include this? If the disciples had really known that Jesus was going to be resurrected, they wouldn't have that fear. If the disciples were faking a resurrection of Jesus, knowing that it hadn't happened, why would you be in fear now about everything? It doesn't really make sense. These are embarrassing details you wouldn't add unless they were really true. And we know of Thomas as well in verse 25 to 27 saying, even when others have seen him, after Mary having seen him and Peter and John, saying, you know what, I won't believe until I actually see him and can touch him. I can actually feel the holes and everything and know it's really him. And really, Thomas represents that natural skeptic within all of us that just wants to say, well, you know, I don't know if I'm going to believe this till I really see it for myself. I don't know if I can just trust you guys on this. You wouldn't include these details unless this is what really happened and it sounds believable. Isn't this how you would react? Surely a man doesn't come back from the dead. Even though Jesus has said it, it's not until you see it and you feel him and you hear him that you can really believe and say, well, it must be true because here he is before me. So number 4, there's those embarrassing moments. Number 5, there's the variety in the gospel accounts. Said previously that all the gospel accounts have this amazing consistency and maintain that over the course of their preaching and ministry beyond just releasing the gospels there. But there's also the natural and healthy variety in the gospel accounts that points to it being true. What I mean is, if all the accounts were identical, you would know that was a cover-up. Because isn't that what happens? You know, when a group is taken in on a crime and questioned and they all have exactly the same story, the same events, you know that's a lie. Because people pick out different things of particular moments. Different people have different ways of thinking and experiencing, so they'll pick out different particular facial expressions that happen, the different tones of voice that happened in that moment. Those natural variances actually point to the genuineness of the gospel accounts. This is really history. This isn't people making it up. This is 4 different people going through the same experience and pulling out the different particular things that they noticed and they sensed and they experienced in those moments. The resurrection was historical. It is an actual event, and the accounts point to that. Chuck Colson, one of the close advisors to President Richard Nixon, involved in the Watergate scandal, where they had been breaking into political opponents' offices, seeking to gain intelligence and things, and then had attempted to cover it up, and then it, of course, comes out. Later becomes a Christian, actually goes into ministry. He later reflects on the whole Watergate scandal and upon the resurrection, and says this: I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified they'd seen Jesus raised from the dead, then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it wasn't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep a lie for 3 weeks. You're telling me that 12 apostles could keep a lie for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. It's a historical event. But number 2, it's physical. And that is important too. New Testament theologian N.T. Wright finds some of his stuff unhelpful. But on resurrection, he makes some really useful comments. Resurrection in first century Judaism. He says that this would have meant to them life after death. What does that mean? Well, everyone believed in a sort of concept of life after death, a sort of soul or spiritual ongoing life. And there were many different words that could be used to express that. Words which the gospel writers choose not to use quite deliberately. Resurrection is a word and a concept quite different. He says that it essentially means life after that. A newly embodied life after a period of being dead. It's quite specific that it's physical life. Verse 14 here, speaking of Mary, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know it was Jesus. Human enough to recognize he's man, but looks somewhat different. Or is it just the fact that she's so convinced that he couldn't be raised that assumes that it must be somebody else? But he's physical, supposing him to be the gardener, it tells us in verse 15. And they have this conversation. Then when Jesus speaks, Mary recognizes his voice and realizes who it really is. We see again further points to the physicality of the resurrection throughout the rest of the account. Jesus comes and stands among a number of the disciples in the upper room there. Comes and stands with them, in front of them, enough for them to record it in that way that he doesn't seem like a ghost. And by the way, they think at other points that they see ghosts. They think at one point that they see Peter's ghost when he's released from prison and returns to them in an upper room and are scared. Okay, but at this point they don't think that. He's clearly physical enough for them to say, well, he just came and stood amongst us, as if it was always him before. We then hear of the encounter with Thomas, where Thomas has been saying, look, I'll only believe it if I can see him and I can touch him. And Jesus is there and says, well, look, touch me. Touch the holes. Feel it for yourself. I'm really a man. Or at least really in a body at this point. And we know later on in John's account here that he'll go on to now cook the disciples' breakfast and presumably eat with them. So revealing that he's still able to eat food with them. We know from Luke's account that he actually does eat with them. He eats a piece of broiled fish. Again, strange detail that you'd only remember if it had really happened in front of you and you thought that this was crazy enough to think, wow. And remember that it was a piece of broiled fish that it was that he ate. It's all pointing always to the physicality of Jesus' resurrection. They want us to know here that Jesus was really physically risen in a body that they could see, that they could touch. This is the essence of John's beginning to his letter, 1 John 1:1, where he'll say, I'm telling you that which we've heard, which we've seen, which we've touched. I'm a witness to this, to the resurrection of Jesus, who we saw, we heard, we touched. I'm vouching my credibility upon this, that I was an eyewitness to this. Bob Yarborough, a commentator that Tim Keller quotes in one of his books, says the variety of verbs that John uses here corresponds to the variety of witness attestations in ancient jurisprudence. And so when John writes, we've seen it and testified to it, and then he speaks of hearing, seeing, and touching, he is not making conversation, but he's virtually swearing a deposition. He's virtually giving witness testimony as if he was in court, saying, I am vouching my name and my credibility upon saying this really happened, and I saw it, I heard him, I touched him. This happened. This matters because if he rose physically, and every evidence here, plus also in the story of Jesus raising Lazarus a little while before he goes on to be raised himself. This matters because it means I can have hope that Jesus will physically resurrect me. And this is the expectation of the apostles. This is what they're expecting to happen. Jesus, Paul will say in 1 Corinthians 15 that he's died and risen again as a first fruits of what we're to expect. That is that he's gone as a sort of forerunner. His resurrection body and journey to resurrection is a pattern and example for what is going to happen for us. And he'll also say in 1 Corinthians 15 that if we have only hoped in Jesus for this life, we're to be pitied above all. Saying, the whole heart and purpose and focus of Christianity is hope for the future. Hope for life after death. Physically. Really. In a new resurrection body like Jesus's that is completely physical, but completely physical minus all the defects. Physical in a new way that we can't quite comprehend. And also clothed with a new spiritual vitality and power, that it's not subject to death, to decay, to sickness, to pain, but is life in all of the fullness that was intended before Adam and Eve fell and brought sin into the world and invoked the curse of sin that gradually causes everything around us and ourselves to decay and to be slowly destroyed. It was physical, and that matters because that gives me such hope of what is to come for me too. It was historical, it was physical. Thirdly, it's central. The resurrection, the historical, bodily, physical resurrection of Jesus Christ became a centre point of Christian theology. And there's four things that the resurrection does. Four reasons why it would be central to our theology. Vindication, glorification, salvation, and recreation. Firstly, vindication. The resurrection is a really central idea and truth and reality and hope because it's the vindication of Jesus. It's proving that he was accepted by God, that he was innocent, that he was the spotless Lamb of God, the Son of God, able to atone for sins because of his righteousness and perfection. And it shows that his sacrifice for sin works. I once had a friend at school and he was trying to understand sort of some of what we believe, especially about Easter and about the resurrection and the cross. And the thing he said to me was, amongst other things, which was interesting, was, yeah, Tom, I don't understand it. What is special about Jesus? In the sense that, if I was put the deal before me that, look, if you die, everybody else, in the world would be saved as a result. I'd like to think, well, I would make the same decision. I would do that. Or at least I'd like to think I would. So, what's so special about Jesus? Why couldn't it have been somebody else? And this gets to the very heart of it. The reason he's resurrected and the reason he needs to be resurrected is the proof that Jesus is set apart from any one of us. It's completely different to if I were to give myself. I could give myself, it wouldn't save anybody because I'm not righteous. I'm not perfect. I'm not unblemished. I'm not an appropriate offering. Jesus' offering upon the cross is, works and is so appropriate because of how spotless and holy and perfect and good that he is. It's the fact of his righteousness that makes it work, that he can absorb my sin and replace that with his righteousness that makes it work. If all he does is absorb sin, that's not enough. I need to be made righteous. It's his righteousness that makes it work. And the resurrection is a vindication of Jesus, that he really is. If he'd stayed in the grave, the question would always be there. Has God really accepted his offering then? If he's still dead? And if he's dead, has he got what he deserved at the end of it? It wouldn't be clear that he'd really been vindicated and proven innocent and righteous and good and accepted. The resurrection vindicates Jesus. It proves that he was exactly who he said he was. And that's so, so important for us to know and to have our hope secured in. Firstly, it vindicates him. Secondly, it's about glorification. The Father glorifies Jesus in his resurrection. The same glory that Jesus had anticipated. He prays in John chapter 17, John records it, of him praying to the Father and saying, look, I've done, paraphrasing him now, you have to go back and read it in all its details. It's a very long and wonderful prayer. I can't quite do it justice, but I'll try to summarize it, paraphrase it. I've done all that you've said. I've said everything that you said and you've given to me and told me to say. I've pointed them to you. I revealed your glory to them. And now I'm coming to you and you're going to glorify me. Now glorify your name by glorifying me. He expects that in his death and resurrection, he'd be glorified for the Lord's name's sake. And here now in the resurrection, he is glorified, finally. Now we're beginning to see Jesus in all of his true glory. He's walked on the earth with his glory somewhat veiled. There's been moments where you've seen bits of it, but nothing quite like the real true fullness that he's had with the Father in eternity before. The kind of glory that he has as John begins his gospel with in chapter 1 of, he was with the Father in the beginning. And that he was, the creation was made through him, that nothing that has life without it coming through him. Now we're beginning finally to see Jesus in all of his true glory for the first sort of time. We'll see it in fullness as he returns the second time for the new earth to be brought about. But in his resurrection, we see him beginning to be glorified as he always ought to have been. It sets Jesus apart. He's far more than a good teacher. Plato, Nietzsche, Darwin, Gandhi, Buddha, Muhammad are all dead. But Jesus is alive. Jesus is set apart from anybody else. He's not just a good moral teacher. He's not just an interesting philosophical teacher, because some of those names are not necessarily good teachers, but interesting philosophical teachers. He's so much more. And his offering is accepted by God, and he is glorified by God, number 2. Thirdly, it's central because it's about salvation. The resurrection means that Jesus is not held by the grip of death, but bursts forth out of the bonds of death. It means that I can trust him to really save me from Satan, from sin, from death, because he wasn't held. So I don't have to be held no longer either in him. Thirdly, it's about salvation. Fourthly, it's about recreation. The resurrection shows that God is moving powerfully to recreate. And Jesus is the first fruits of it, the first example of what he's going to do en masse. That he's going to restore and renew and redeem and recreate his entire creation with his people at the heart of it too. That gives me hope that he'll recreate my body and this earth in eternity too, because he's done it to his Son. The resurrection is absolutely central to Christianity. In fact, Paul believes in, as he's put on trial in Acts chapter 24, verse 21, he says, I'm essentially on trial because of my belief in the resurrection. Everything else I believe is common and consistent to Judaism. I believe all of those old scriptures, but what I'm saying is they're fulfilled in Jesus and fulfilled in his resurrection from death after being sacrificed upon the cross. I'm in prison really principally because I believe in the resurrection, and there's people here who do not. The resurrection reshapes the way in which we see everything else within the world. The resurrection is historical, it was physical, it is central, and fourthly, lastly, it changes everything. Japanese writer Shusaka Endo wrote a book in 1973 called A Life of Jesus. And he says this really amazing thing about the resurrection here. He says, if you don't believe in the resurrection, you'll be forced to believe that something else hit the disciples that was every bit as amazing, different in kind, yet of equal force in its electrifying intensity. For if they try to explain the changed lives of the early Christians, we may make leaps of faith as great as if you had believed in the resurrection itself. The absolute fundamental changes within the lives of those first believers points to the fact that the resurrection really happened, and it tells us that the resurrection changes everything. This is a resurrection that the disciples initially did not believe, and are honest enough to tell us that they didn't initially believe it. It's only then when they see him risen that it begins to dawn on them what has happened. We see Jesus here appearing to some of the disciples again. Verse 21 here, he comes into the upper room where they're meeting. They're full of fear, not knowing what's going to happen in the future, not really knowing what has happened to him already, not understanding really the witness testimony they've already had of people seeing the empty tomb and seeing Jesus risen. Jesus appears with them and says, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, even so I'm sending you." The resurrection absolutely changes everything. And here is Jesus now again commissioning the disciples to go out and to be witnesses and to go and to live in the world just as Jesus had lived in the world, seeking to point to the glory of God the Father in all things, just as Jesus had spent his life in his first coming doing. We see a complete and fundamental change within the disciples, especially within Peter. I mean, look at Peter, who just a chapter or so ago was so afraid of a slave girl that he was vehemently denying he'd ever known Jesus. Now turns on Pentecost to be boldly teaching the truth of Christ in a setting in which, potentially he's in great danger for the things he's saying. And he's incredibly upfront and blunt with his message. I mean, you can read it there in Acts chapter 2, that he's essentially saying, look, here's this Jesus that you have put to death, and it's your fault. You've killed him. You've killed him because you're stubborn, and you've actually always resisted the prophets. You're a stubborn and a stiff-necked people, and that's why you've killed him. And yet, God has glorified Jesus and honoured him. He's lifted him from the grave and risen him. And this is the Jesus who's doing all these things that you see happening before you today. We see Peter, who was once so weak and cowardly, so bold. And John gives us an insight into the life-changing effects of the resurrection here. He says in verse 31, his purpose for writing it, these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. And he wants you to respond. He wants you to respond to the fundamental change of the resurrection here and see it borne out in your life here. It changes our past because it means our past can actually be killed off and left behind. It's not just that I hope to bury and suppress things until it just inevitably reappears and reemerges and continues to affect and destroy my life. But there's hope here that Jesus' resurrection secures new life, and therefore death of my old life and freedom from sin and shame. You can read 1 Peter 1 verse 3 to see that. The resurrection affects my past. It also affects my present, secondly, that I can actually live empowered by the resurrection, not trapped by genetics, not trapped by circumstances to simply just keep repeating the same old mistakes, but by the power of the resurrection of Christ born out within me, I can live a new, transformed and empowered life. Paul says this in Philippians chapter 3 verse 10, that he wants to know the power of the resurrection working within him, working godliness and righteousness within me, that I may truly live. It affects my past, it affects my present, it affects my future, because it offers me new life where things are restored, not just making the best of things for maybe 80 years or so if I can get so lucky. I don't have to submit to fatalism, but I can really hope that things will really change and be relentlessly hopeful of a world in which Jesus is coming again to restore and renew, making all things new, it tells us in Revelation chapter 21, where I am resurrected, but the world around me is resurrected and redeemed and restored and renewed. A world free of sickness, pain, death, suffering and sadness. Jesus rises again. It is historical. It really happened. It is physical. It was not just a metaphor. It's central, and it changes everything. And so I encourage you to believe, but not only that, to have your life resurrected, to be clothed in the power of the resurrection for your present, and to be hoping for a resurrection into the future. And so living out of hope, living out of joy, living out of real resurrection power, transforming you, and living in freedom from the sin and shame of your past. Friends, let's be looking to the hope and the reality of the resurrection this day and evermore. The Lord bless you.